Alright, let's talk about forms. Forms are used to gather information from a user in order to do something with it. Examples of forms are contact forms like you see here, a comment form, blog post form, voting form, checkout form when you're shopping, and a ton of other examples. A form is a collection of inputs using HTML, and data entered into a form is then sent to some kind of dynamic language to process it and perform some action. Let's walk through this diagram, which I've linked in the description below. First, the user is presented with a form. This is a form I've taken from printful.com, and it's a very simple form that just includes name, email, topic, message, and a checkbox to agree, and of course the button to submit. When the user hits submit, data is sent over to some kind of form processing language, like PHP, Node.js, Python, etc. The job of this language is to validate and filter out any garbage. And when it determines whether it's good or bad, it performs some action with it. Now, in the case that it's bad, let's say they entered some email that wasn't valid. It would then send them back to the form with an error, and it would typically get displayed to the user, and then the input that was bad would get highlighted in red and a message would get displayed. Once the user fixes that, all the other data on the form typically gets returned, so the user doesn't have to enter it again unless it's missing. And in this case, the email would be fixed. They'd hit submit again. The data would go back to the processor. And if it's good this time, then it gets sent on to some action. And here are some examples of some actions that would typically happen. It could get saved to a database. An email might get generated. Several emails might get generated. And the user might get added to a mailing list. But of course, there are tons of other examples of what you could do with form data. Now, after something is done with the data, the user's browser is typically redirected back to the form with some kind of success message. And it's either displayed on the form or it replaces the form. And that's the typical flow for any form using HTML and some kind of dynamic language. Now, the next thing we're going to do is take a look at this form that I've already made, and we're going to remake this from the ground up. Now, it may look a little overwhelming at first, but trust me, it's not that bad. Let's jump over into our editor and create a new document called form.html. Let's use Emmet to create our document, HTML:5. Let's call this one form. And we'll give it an H1, a form. Actually, let's call it the same thing. Form register user. Now, of course, to format our form, we're going to use a table. So let's start that first. This table is built up of 2 columns. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 rows. So let's create those now. I'm just going to create the skeleton of the form in table format. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Save that. Now, let's wrap the table with the tag we're going to be using, which is, of course, the form tag. Now we have to be careful to wrap the entire form or anything that we want to get included with the form using the form tag. Anything outside of this tag will not get included when it gets submitted. Let's start adding some attributes to our form. First one is name. Name is typically used by JavaScript to help differentiate different forms, and it can be helpful when you're reading through your source code to differentiate similar forms if they look really similar. Let's just call this one registration. We also have an action, and this is where data gets sent when the form is submitted. Let's leave this alone for now. We'll come back to it. The next one is method. The different methods you can use to submit a form are get and post. Get and post are two methods that let you send data from your browser to the server. Let's go over this a little more in depth before we continue. Here's another diagram I've created, which is linked in the description below, to help us illustrate the difference between get and post. As you can see here, form processing methods fall into two types, like we said, get and post, and are the way data gets from your web browser to the server. Now, a GET request is generally used to read data. It sends data by appending it to the URL as parameters in name-value pairs, just like you see here. And we'll see an example of that later. This is only used for data that isn't sensitive, as it does get cached by the web browser. Now, POST requests are generally used to write data. They send data in the HTTP header, which is invisible to the user, so it's never cached and never actually seen, except behind the scenes, of course. And it helps send more sensitive data, larger data, and you can even send binary files. Now that we have a better sense for form methods, let's jump in and build out our form some more. Now, as you can see here, each item in the form is composed of a label and some kind of input, except for the buttons, of course. They don't really have labels, but they do act as inputs. Another thing you'll notice is that when I click on a label, except in some cases, it will interact with the input. So clicking on first name activates the first name input, clicking on last name activates the last name input, and so on. This is done using the label tag. We'll create a label for each one of these, except in the case of the checkbox and radio button inputs, which behave a little differently. So if I click these, they do not activate, but if I click their corresponding label, they do. Let's go ahead and create some of these and start building out the form. First name, input type equals. So I'll build out this input a little more before I explain what it does. But let's type out input type equals text, name equals first name, and the value is empty. Okay, let's save this and see how it looks in the browser. And again, I'm just going to drag this over into a new tab. And notice when I click on this, it's not activating the input. That's because I have to tell the label which input it corresponds to. And I do that using another property called ID. One thing to note about ID is that the browser typically expects these to be unique per web page. So if you have the same form existing multiple times on the page, this is going to get confusing for your browser and correspondingly your user. But in this case, let's just keep it simple. To point the label at the right ID, we have to say label for and give it the ID name. Let's save that and see how it looks. Now when I click on first name, it activates the corresponding input. Let's go through and create some more of our inputs to match our form here. Let me make this so it's a little bit easier. Actually, I'll move this over here. I'm going to minimize this. Get that all lined up. Okay, that's much better. So let's go a little bit faster here. And I'm going to actually copy this over this next one since it's virtually the same. And I'm going to call it last name. Let's copy this over here since these are all basically the same. Save that, refresh, just make sure we're doing the right stuff. And we are. Okay. All right, let's create the email input. So very similar. There is one difference, however. The input type for email has its own input type of email. The cool thing about these custom input types is that they offer some browser level validation. Another benefit here is that it tells the browser to treat this like an email. So it will autofill any email you have in your browser so long as you've allowed that behavior. So let's save that, see how it behaves. Great. Okay, so let's go to the next one. The next one is password. So we're going to, again, copy and paste this down. I'm going to call this password. Password is the label. The type is, you guessed it, password. The ID and the name are password. Save it and refresh. Now again, this has some custom behavior. When I click in here and type, it covers up whatever I type, just like any other password field you've ever used. Now, the next input is a little bit different. This is a dropdown. And to build a dropdown, we still give it a label. But we don't create an input tag. Instead, we create a select tag. Give it a name. Give it an ID to correspond with the label here. And the select tag options are made up of option tags. Let's see, what did we create here? We said girl, boy, and whoa, that's too personal. So let's say girl, boy, whoa, too personal. Now, if we're submitting these to the server, sometimes the data that gets stored in the database won't correspond necessarily to the values we enter here. So to give the option a different value, which is typically the case, we'll give it a value property. Okay, let's save that, see how it looks. All right, so we have our three options here, but I forgot to actually put the blank option in, so let's do that really quick. And that's literally just a blank option there, so let's save that really quick. All right, that looks better. Okay, so the next one is pick your favorite color, and that looks a little different. So let's just type in pick your favorite color, no label on this one. And we're going to do something a little bit differently. So now we're going to wrap each input in its own label. But for this, we don't need an ID because it's going to wrap the input. And let me show you what I mean. So we give it a label tag, and then inside, we give it an input type of radio. And since it's favorite color, the name is going to be favorite color, and the value is going to be red, just like you see here. And since we're still inside the label, we can just type out red. And we can copy this down and do this for each color we specified. Blue, green. I'll save that and show you how it looks. Okay, so notice when I click on these, the corresponding radio option gets highlighted. And in a radio button, I can only select one item at a time. Let's move on to the checkbox type, which will allow us to enter one or more inputs at the same time. So this is going to be very similar to the radio inputs. Pick as many as you want. Now we're going to create another label. We're going to give it an input type of checkbox this time, and it's going to be favorite pet. Value, oh, yes, value equals dog. Let's put dog next to it inside the label again. And let's copy it down 4 times since we're giving them 4 pet options. Cat, fish, hamster, let's save that and see how it looks. Looking good. Now, the last input down here is a text area input, and this allows us to do things like enter comments or multiple lines. And it's generally free-form input. So let's put our label here. Label for comments. And we're going to build out a text area with a name of comments and an ID of comments. And we'll see how this looks. It's great. However, if we refresh this, we'll notice that this is a little bigger. And that's because I've specified some columns and rows. And that's with the calls property. So let's say 30 columns, 30 characters wide. And then rows, let's say 20. And let's save that. Okay, that's looking a little weird. So let's do 50 columns and 10 rows. That's looking better. Okay, one thing that I've kind of skipped over here that's very important is that each input has a name and a corresponding value. Name is what gets sent to the server. So in this case, the name would be first name and the value would be whatever input you would give it. In the case of first name, last name, and all these singular inputs, it's simply going to be the key or name, which is email or last name, equals, and whatever value you put in. For radio buttons and checkboxes, this data is typically sent a little differently, and we'll show you how this works. So now that we've created the form again, let's use this PHP file I've created to receive data and see what each method looks like and what data looks like when it's received. So to do this, I'm going to have to do something a little more complicated than we've been doing. I'm going to create a little tiny server. And I'm just going to use PHP for that. Let's give it a port of 8000. Don't be daunted by this. This is really simple stuff. I'm just pointing to this directory and giving it a very simple HTTP server. So I can click here. It's going to load my home page. And if we navigate over to form.html, we'll see we have our form. Ooh, forgot to give it some buttons. Let's go back and do that really quick. And that is a button. Type equals submit. And then we have our reset button, which is type of reset. And we save that, hit refresh, and there it is. And right now when we hit submit, let's see what happens actually, because I don't really have an action in there. So let's see what it does. Okay, so it's doing a get method send. So it sends things in key value pairs using the URL, like we showed in our diagram. Okay, so let's minimize this again. Let's give this an action. So as you can see here, it's defaulting to get. So the first thing we'll do is try to send it over to our form.php. So let's put the address in for that. Form.php. Let's save that and refresh. And let's type in some details here. So got to be careful not to put in a real password. Who are we kidding? We love all pets. All right, let's hit submit. don't want to save that. And notice that only the get variable gets filled up, and that's because it's treated as a get. And we could literally edit this stuff up here if we wanted, but you can really see how things are treated. So this item that was in a checkbox gets sent multiple times. And actually, one thing we have to do that I completely forgot about is make this into an array so that it gets sent multiple times and not just one. Notice that this is only sending, notice that this is only sending hamster when it really should be showing all the pets. So in the case of a checkbox, you can name it favorite pet and then you give it brackets so that it will send multiple options. So let's save that. Let's go back and refresh. And let's just try this really quick. That's better. So now it's sending both options. It's sending them as an array. And both are being received by the server. Okay. Much better. So let's do the same thing, only let's use a post method call and see how data gets treated differently. So let's save this. Let's get rid of this stuff so it's less confusing. Let's get rid of this one. And let's fill this out one more time. Okay, so now instead of filling out the get variable, all the data in the form is received as a post. And you'll see that the password is sent in plain text. The favorite pets are still sent in an array, and everything else is virtually the same. So the cool thing to notice here is that we can treat both of these on the server side essentially the same. It's just that post is automatically more secure. And so forms will generally be set to a post method type, but just note that get is possible. It's just not preferred. Okay. Now, of course, forms can get a whole lot more complex. They can get longer. There are other options available. If you're really interested in that, I suggest you go read up on it on the website. I'll link in the description for you. But otherwise, that's basically all you need to know about HTML forms.